What scientific truths aren't actually true anymore? Story 1. When I was younger, it was basically treated as fact that letting kids sleep with a nightlight would mess up their eyes and make them more likely to need glasses. Later in life, and people were pretty confident about it too, like it had already been studied and proven and there was no reason to question it. And the weird part is, the data actually did show a connection. Kids who had nightlights were more likely to end up needing glasses. So on the surface, it looked like a clean cause and effect situation. Light at night eye development gets affected worse vision. Simple. Except that's not what was actually happening. What later researchers figured out, including work by people like Carla Zadnik, was that the real link wasn't the light at all. It was the parents. Parents who already had poor eyesight were more likely to use nightlights, not because they were worried about damaging their kids' vision, but because without glasses, they couldn't see well in the dark. So having some light in the room made it easier to check on their kids at night. And those same parents were also more likely to pass on genes related to needing glasses. So the kids who ended up with nightlights were also the kids who were more likely to inherit vision issues in the first place. Which means the nightlight wasn't causing anything. It was just sitting in the middle of a completely different relationship, making it look like it was the reason when it really wasn't. And that's the part that sticks. Something can look completely proven, backed by data, widely accepted, and still be wrong. Not because the numbers were fake, but because the interpretation missed a hidden variable. It's one of those cases where science didn't fail, it just corrected itself. But it's a good reminder that even proven truths can fall apart once you look a little deeper at what's actually driving the result. Story 2. For a long time, it was treated as fact that a Komodo dragon killed its prey just by having a filthy, bacteria-filled mouth, like the bite itself wasn't the main problem, but the infection that came after. The idea was that they'd bite something, the wound would get infected, and the animal would weaken over time until the Komodo dragon could finish it off. And it made sense at the time. Big lizard, dirty mouth, slow death. Simple explanation. Except it turns out that wasn't the full story at all. Later research showed that Komodo dragons actually have venom glands. And not just in a minor way either, but producing compounds that affect blood pressure, clotting, and shock. So instead of relying on bacteria to do the job, the bite itself is doing a lot of the work immediately. The venom causes rapid blood loss, prevents clotting, and can send the prey into a kind of systemic collapse much faster than an infection ever would, which completely changes how you look at it. It's not a slow, dirty kill predator. It's something much more precise and biologically specialized than people originally thought. And the crazy part is the original idea wasn't totally made up. Their mouths do contain bacteria, like most animals, but that detail got overemphasized and turned into the main explanation, when in reality, it was just one piece of a much more complex system. So for years, something that was widely accepted and taught as fact turned out to be incomplete. Not because people weren't studying it, but because they hadn't looked closely enough at the right mechanism yet. It's one of those cases where the truth didn't flip completely, it just got sharper and way more interesting. Story 3. I've heard versions of this too, and it's one of those things that sounds kind of logical at first if you don't dig into what radiation actually means. But once you understand the physics, it falls apart pretty quickly. Microwaves do use radiation, but not the kind people are thinking of. There's a huge difference between ionizing radiation, like X-rays, or nuclear radiation, which can damage DNA, and non-ionizing radiation, which is what microwave ovens use, and that kind of radiation doesn't have enough energy to alter molecules in that way. A microwave oven is basically just using electromagnetic waves to make water molecules in food vibrate really fast, which generates heat. That's it. No lingering radiation, no contamination, nothing left behind in the food after it's done. The waves stop the moment the microwave turns off, so eating microwaved food is no different from a radiation standpoint than eating food heated on a stove or in an oven. The confusion usually comes from the word radiation itself, because people associate it with nuclear disasters or cancer, when in reality, it just means energy traveling through space, which includes everything from visible light to radio waves. And culturally, these kinds of beliefs can spread really easily, especially when there's a mix of partial truth and misunderstanding. Microwaves sound scientific, radiation sounds dangerous, and without clear explanations, it's easy for people to connect the dots in the wrong way. So it ends up becoming one of those common sense warnings in certain places, even though the actual science behind it is pretty straightforward. It's a good example of how something can feel risky just because of the language used to describe it, even when the mechanism itself is completely safe under normal use. Story 4. For a long time, Neanderthals got this reputation as these hunched, slow, almost caveman caricatures, like barely functioning humans that were just waiting to be replaced by us. And a big part of that came from one of the earliest skeletons studied, which just happened to belong to an individual with serious health issues, including something like rickets or arthritis, so the posture looked bent and awkward. And instead of recognizing that as a sick individual, it got generalized to the entire species. So suddenly, Neanderthals became the hunched ones, and that image stuck for decades. But as more fossils were studied, it became clear that wasn't accurate at all. They stood upright, had strong, robust builds, and were actually very well adapted to their environments, especially colder climates where their body shape helped conserve heat. And intelligence-wise, they were far from primitive. They made tools, controlled fire, hunted in coordinated ways, and there's evidence they cared for injured members of their group, which suggests some level of social structure and empathy. Their cranial capacity was on average even slightly larger than that of modern humans, which doesn't automatically mean they were smarter, but definitely challenges the idea that they were somehow inferior in a simple sense. So the whole dumb hunched caveman image wasn't based on solid evidence. It was based on an early mistake that got repeated and simplified over time. And once it got into textbooks and popular culture, it just stuck. It's one of those cases where the first interpretation shaped the narrative so strongly that it took a long time for the correction to catch up, even after better data was available, which is kind of a pattern with a lot of these scientific truths that turned out to be more about early assumptions than reality. Story 5. For a long time, eye color was taught like it was one of those clean, high school Punnett square examples, where blue is recessive, brown is dominant, and too blue-eyed. Parents should only ever produce blue-eyed kids. End of story. And that's a nice, simple way to introduce genetics. But it's not how it actually works in real life. Eye color isn't controlled by a single gene with a simple dominant recessive relationship. It's influenced by multiple genes interacting together, especially ones involved in melanin production and distribution in the iris. Genes like OCA2 gene and HERC2 gene play major roles, but they're part of a bigger network rather than a single on-off switch. So what can happen is that two blue-eyed parents might both carry genetic variants that don't express as brown eyes in them, but when combined in a child, they can produce enough melanin to result in darker eyes. It's rare, but it's possible. And that's the key point. Punnett squares aren't wrong. They're just simplified models that only really apply cleanly to traits controlled by a single gene, like some classic textbook examples. Once you move into traits influenced by multiple genes, things get messy fast. So what was taught as a rule is really more of a guideline that works in many cases, but not all. It's one of those situations where science didn't change, our understanding just got more detailed, and the simplified version people learned early on turned out to be an oversimplification of a much more complex system. Story 6. The whole "we only use 10% of our brains" thing sounds cool, but it doesn't survive even a basic look at how the brain actually works, because the brain is ridiculously expensive to run. It uses around 20% of the body's energy, while only making up a small fraction of body weight. So from an evolutionary standpoint, carrying around something that costly only makes sense if it's being used pretty much all the time. Otherwise, it would have been selected again a long time ago. And when you actually look at brain activity, like with modern imaging, You don't see 90% sitting there dormant, waiting to be unlocked. You see different regions activating at different times, depending on what you're doing, thinking, feeling, or even just resting. Even when you're doing nothing, the brain is still active, maintaining bodily functions, processing background information, running internal networks. All of it adds up. It's not like there's a giant unused reserve just sitting there. The idea probably stuck around because it's simple and appealing. It makes it feel like there's hidden potential waiting to be tapped into, like you could suddenly unlock something and become massively more capable. But in reality, brain function is more about coordination and efficiency than unlocking unused sections. You're already using essentially all of it, just not all at once, which makes a lot more sense biologically, even if it's less exciting as a myth. Story 7. That the whole alpha wolf idea sounds solid because it was presented as science for years, but it turns out it was based on a really flawed setup that doesn't. Reflect how wolves actually live in the wild. The original concept came from studies on captive wolves, where unrelated individuals were thrown together in artificial environments, which naturally led to competition, dominance struggles, and aggressive hierarchies forming. So researchers described the top individuals as alphas and built the whole model around that. But that situation isn't how wolf packs exist in nature. In the wild, packs are usually just families, a breeding pair and their offspring, sometimes spanning multiple years. So what looks like an alpha is really just the parents, guiding the group, not some dominant leader constantly fighting to maintain control. Even David Mech, one of the scientists who helped spread the idea early on, later came out and clarified that the term was misleading and shouldn't be used the way it had been. So the behavior people think of as alpha dominance is mostly a misunderstanding based on wolves in unnatural conditions, not how they normally operate. And yet the idea refuses to die. It spread into pop culture, self-help, business language, and this whole personality framework about being alpha or beta, which has almost nothing to do with actual wolf behavior anymore. So even after science corrected itself, the simplified version stuck because it's easy to understand and easy to apply to human behavior, even if it's not accurate. It's one of those cases where the original mistake didn't just get fixed, it turned into a cultural concept that outlived the science that created it. Story 8, that your hair and fingernails keep growing after you die, is one of those things that sounds creepy enough that people never question it, even though it doesn't actually hold up once you look at how the body works. Because growth isn't something that just happens on its own. Hair and nails grow because living cells in the follicles and nail matrix are actively dividing, and that process needs oxygen, nutrients, blood flow, all the things that stop the moment the body dies. So once death occurs, those cells shut down along with everything else. No circulation, no energy, no growth. What actually creates the illusion is what happens to the rest of the body. As it begins to dehydrate, the skin and surrounding tissue start to shrink and pull back, especially around the fingers and face, which exposes more of the nail and hair shaft. That was already there, so it looks like the nails are longer, the hair looks more pronounced, but nothing new has been produced. It's not growth, it's a contrast. And because that visual change happens gradually, it reinforces the idea that something is still growing, when in reality, it's just the surrounding tissue receding and revealing what was always there. It's one of those explanations that feels counterintuitive at first, but once you understand the biology, the myth kind of collapses immediately. Story 9, that sugar makes kids hyper, is one of those things that feels so obviously true to people that it barely even gets questioned, even though controlled studies have been pushing back on it for years. Because on the surface, it looks like a perfect cause and effect. The kid eats cake, drinks soda, and runs around like crazy. So sugar must be the reason, except when researchers actually test it properly, giving kids sugar in some cases and artificial sweeteners in others, without parents knowing which is which. The results don't line up with that belief. Parents still report hyperactivity even when the kid didn't actually have sugar, which is where it gets interesting. The expectation changes the perception. If someone believes sugar causes hyperbehavior, they're more likely to notice and remember energetic moments after the kid eats something sweet and ignore the same behavior at other times. It's not that the kids are acting completely differently, it's that the behavior is being interpreted differently, depending on what the adult thinks caused it. And then you add context. Sugary foods are usually given at parties, celebrations, or exciting environments where kids are already stimulated, running around, playing with others, so the energy is coming from the situation, not necessarily the sugar itself. But because sugar is the obvious variable, it gets the blame. So the idea sticks. Even when the data doesn't support a direct link, the combination of expectation, environment, and selective memory keeps reinforcing the belief. It's one of those cases where the experience feels real, but the explanation behind it isn't quite right. Story 10. That what feels like science being wrong is actually just science doing exactly what it's supposed to do. Because the whole point isn't to land on permanent truths. It's to get closer and closer to reality by constantly correcting itself over time. A theory isn't meant to be the final answer. It's the best explanation we have right now based on the evidence available. And as new tools, better data, and improved methods come in, those explanations get refined, adjusted, or sometimes completely replaced. So what people often see as flip-flopping is really just progress. Like early models being simple because that's all we could handle at the time, and then later becoming more complex and accurate as we learn more. It's not that scientists were careless before, it's that they were working with limited information, and once those limits are pushed, the picture changes. And that means a lot of what we know now will probably be updated in the future too. Not necessarily thrown out entirely, but sharpened, expanded, or reframed in ways that make today's understanding look incomplete, which is kind of the whole system working as intended. The unsettling part, if anything, is realizing there's no final version where everything is perfectly known. Just better and better approximations. Always moving, never finished. Story 11. That goldfish only have a 3-second memory is one of those facts that got repeated so many times it just turned into common knowledge, even though it was never really accurate in the first place. Because when people actually studied goldfish in controlled settings, it turned out they can learn patterns, recognize routines, and remember things for surprisingly long periods of time, sometimes weeks or even months. They can be trained to associate certain signals with food, navigate simple environments, and even anticipate feeding times, which you just wouldn't expect from something that forgets everything after a few seconds. So the whole 3-second memory idea doesn't really hold up. It likely came from early assumptions about fish being simple or lacking intelligence, and once that idea took hold, it stuck, because it's easy to repeat and kind of funny. But like a lot of these examples, it's just an oversimplification that turned into a myth, not because people were lying, but because the original understanding was shallow and never really corrected in popular culture. And the interesting part is how many of these facts follow the same pattern. Simple idea, widely accepted, rarely questioned, until someone actually tests it properly and finds out it's way more complex than it sounded. Story 12, that we lose most of our body heat through our head, is one of those things that sounds scientific, gets repeated forever, and then just sticks even after people realize it's not actually how heat loss works. Because the original claim made it seem like the head was somehow special, like it was this major heat leaking point compared to the rest of the body. But it isn't. Heat loss is basically proportional to how much skin is exposed, not which body part it is. So if your head is uncovered while the rest of your body is bundled up in layers, then yeah, you'll lose a noticeable amount of heat from your head. But that's not because your head is uniquely bad at holding heat. It's just because it's the only part not insulated. If you went outside in the cold wearing only a hat and nothing else, you definitely wouldn't lose most of your heat through your head anymore. The rest of your body would be doing that job very quickly. So the idea came from a specific scenario, like military studies, where people were bundled up everywhere except the head, and then got turned into a general rule about human biology. And once it was simplified like that, it stuck. It's another example of something that wasn't completely made up, but got taken out of context and turned into a misleading fact that people repeat without thinking about the conditions behind it. Story 13. That yawning means you're just tired or bored is one of those explanations that feels right because of when it happens, but it turns out that's probably just the surface level effect, not the actual reason your body does it. And the older idea that yawning is about getting more oxygen into your blood doesn't really hold up either, because experiments where people breathe pure oxygen don't reduce. Yawning and breathing air with more carbon dioxide doesn't increase it the way you'd expect if that were the cause. So the explanation started shifting. The current thinking is that yawning is tied more to brain regulation than to simple tiredness, specifically things like temperature and state changes in the brain. When you yawn, you're stretching your jaw, increasing blood flow to the head, and drawing in cooler air, which may help regulate brain temperature, basically cooling things down slightly and helping maintain optimal function. So instead of you're bored, so you yawn, it's more like your brain is adjusting itself. And boredom or fatigue just happen to be situations where that adjustment gets triggered more often. And then there's the newer angle you mentioned, with research out of University of New South Wales suggesting that yawning might also help move cerebrospinal fluid around, which could play a role in clearing waste products from the brain. It's still early and small scale, but it adds another layer. So instead of one simple reason, yawning starts to look like a multi-purpose mechanism, helping regulate temperature, shift brain states, and possibly assist with internal cleanup, which is way more complex than the old "you're just bored" explanation. And like a lot of these examples, it's not that the old idea was completely wrong, it's just that it was incomplete. And once people started looking closer, the real picture turned out to be a lot more interesting than the simple version everyone learned. Story 14. That deoxygenated blood is blue is one of those things that gets stuck in people's heads because of how it's taught visually, not because it's actually true. Because in diagrams, arteries are shown in red and veins are shown in blue, which makes it look like oxygen-rich blood is red and oxygen-poor blood is blue. But that color coding is just for clarity. In reality, blood is always some shade of red. Oxygenated blood is a brighter, more vivid red, while deoxygenated blood is darker, more maroon or deep red, but never blue. The reason veins can look blue through your skin has more to do with how light interacts with tissue than the color of the blood itself. Skin absorbs and scatters different wavelengths of light, and the way blue light is reflected back to your eyes can make veins appear bluish, even though the blood inside them is still red. So it's not the blood changing color, it's your perception changing based on how light travels through layers of skin. And once that visual shorthand got introduced in textbooks and diagrams, it kind of stuck as a literal interpretation for a lot of people. It's another case where a teaching tool ended up being mistaken for reality, just because it was simple and easy to remember. Story 15. The Stanford Marshmallow experiment became one of those iconic proofs that self-control in childhood determines your entire future, because the setup was so simple and compelling that it felt like it revealed something deep about human nature in a way anyone could understand. Kids were left alone with a marshmallow and told that if they could wait without eating it, they'd get to later. And when researchers followed those children over time, they initially found that the ones who waited longer tended to do better in school, scored higher on tests, and were described as more capable by their parents, which made it seem like the ability to delay gratification was this built-in trait that shaped long-term success. And for years that idea spread everywhere, from psychology to education to self-help, because it told a clean story that people liked, that discipline early in life leads directly to better outcomes later on. But as more researchers revisited the experiment with larger samples and better controls, that clean story started to fall apart, because it turned out the ability to wait wasn't just about internal willpower. It was heavily influenced by context, especially trust. If a child believes the adult will actually come back with a second marshmallow, then waiting makes sense. But if they've learned from experience that promises aren't always kept, then eating the marshmallow immediately is actually the more rational decision, not a failure of self-control. And when factors like family background, early cognitive ability, and home environment were accounted for, the long-term predictive power of the test dropped significantly. With more recent studies, including newer research around 2024, showing that the marshmallow test doesn't meaningfully predict adult outcomes in the way it was originally claimed. So instead of revealing some intrinsic difference between kids who succeed and those who don't, it ends up reflecting how children adapt to the reliability and structure of the world around them, which is a much more complex and less comforting conclusion than the original version everyone believed. Story 16. That moderate drinking, especially red wine, is good for you became one of those widely accepted health truths because early studies seemed to show that people who drank small amounts regularly had better health outcomes than people who didn't drink at all, which led to the idea that something in the wine itself, like antioxidants or compounds such as resveratrol, was actively beneficial. And it sounded convincing because it fit with real biological mechanisms and also lined up with cultural habits in places where people drank wine regularly and still lived long lives. But the problem was in how those comparisons were made. When researchers started digging deeper, they realized that the group labeled as non-drinkers wasn't as clean as it looked because it often included people who had quit drinking due to health problems, people with a history of alcohol misuse, or individuals who were already dealing with underlying conditions, which meant they were starting from a different baseline. At the same time, people who drank moderately, especially things like red wine, tended to differ in other ways too, often having higher incomes, better access to healthcare, healthier diets, and generally more stable lifestyles, all of which contribute to better long-term health outcomes. So what looked like a benefit from alcohol itself was often just a reflection of those other factors. Once studies began separating lifelong abstainers from former drinkers and controlling more carefully for socioeconomic status, lifestyle, and health history, the supposed protective effect of moderate drinking became much weaker and in many cases disappeared entirely, which shifts the conclusion pretty dramatically. Instead of alcohol being beneficial, it becomes more like something that may not be as harmful in small amounts for some people, but doesn't provide the kind of health advantage it was once thought to. And it ends up being another example of how a real pattern in the data can lead to a misleading conclusion when important variables aren't accounted for properly. Story 17. That the human brain is fully mature at 25 is one of those numbers that sounds precise enough to feel like a hard biological cutoff, but it mostly comes from how a study was designed rather than what the brain actually does. The idea traces back to longitudinal brain imaging research that followed development through adolescence into early adulthood and noticed that areas like the prefrontal cortex, which are involved in decision-making and impulse control, were still developing into the mid-20s, so people simplified that into a clean headline: the brain finishes developing at 25. But the key detail is that those studies didn't track people indefinitely. They stopped around that age. So what they really showed was that development was still ongoing up to 25, not that it suddenly stopped there. And when you look at neuroscience more broadly, the brain doesn't have a fixed done point at all. It continues to change across the entire lifespan through processes like synaptic pruning, myelination, and neuroplasticity, meaning connections are constantly being strengthened, weakened, or reorganized based on experience. So instead of a finish line, it's more like a shifting curve. Certain systems stabilize earlier, others keep adapting, and some changes don't even begin until later in life, which means the 25 number isn't completely meaningless. It just got turned into something much more definitive than it actually is. It marks a general phase where some developmental processes are still ongoing, not a biological switch where the brain suddenly becomes complete. And like a lot of these examples, it's a case where a nuanced finding got compressed into a simple, memorable fact that ended up being misleading once it spread outside the original context. Story 18, that depression is caused by a chemical imbalance, specifically low serotonin, became one of the most widely accepted explanations because it was simple, intuitive, and easy to communicate, even though the actual science behind it was always more uncertain than people realized. The so-called serotonin hypothesis suggested that reduced levels of serotonin in the brain were the primary cause of depression, which lined up neatly with how certain antidepressants, like SSRIs, work by increasing serotonin availability. So it created a clean story where cause and treatment seemed directly connected. But over time, when researchers tried to find consistent direct evidence that people with depression actually have lower serotonin levels, the results didn't hold up in a clear or universal way. Some studies found differences, others didn't. And there wasn't a reliable method to measure serotonin in the living brain in a way that could definitively prove the theory. At the same time, even though medications that affect serotonin can help some people, that doesn't necessarily mean serotonin deficiency is the root cause, because drugs can influence complex systems in ways that improve symptoms without addressing a single underlying imbalance. So instead of a straightforward cause and effect, depression started to look more like a multifactorial condition involving genetics, environment, stress, brain structure, neurochemistry, and life experience all interacting in complicated ways, which means serotonin might still play a role, but not in the simple low levels cause depression sense that was widely taught and repeated. And that's what changed. Not that serotonin is irrelevant, but that the original hypothesis was too narrow and too confident for something that is actually much more complex. It's another example of how a clear, easy explanation can spread far beyond the evidence that originally supported it, especially when it connects neatly to treatments and public understanding. Story 19, that coffee dehydrates you, is one of those things that sounds scientifically grounded, because people hear that caffeine is a diuretic and immediately jump to the conclusion that drinking coffee must make you lose more water than you take in. But that's not really how it works in practice. Yes, caffeine can have a mild diuretic effect, especially if you're not used to it, but it's relatively small and your body adapts to it quickly with regular consumption, which means habitual coffee or tea drinkers barely experience that effect at all. At the same time, drinks like coffee, tea, and even soda are mostly water, often well over 90%. So when you drink them, you're still taking in a significant amount of fluid that contributes to your overall hydration. So instead of causing dehydration, they still count toward your daily fluid intake. And for most people, they function more like a net positive than a net loss. The confusion comes from isolating one property, the diuretic effect, and ignoring the bigger picture of how much fluid is actually being consumed alongside it. So while extremely high caffeine intake in unusual conditions could contribute to fluid loss, normal consumption of coffee or similar drinks doesn't dehydrate you the way people often assume. It's another example of how a technically true detail can get exaggerated into a misleading rule when it's taken out of context. Story 20, that Viking warriors were all men, is one of those ideas that stuck because of how history was written and portrayed for a long time, not because that's what the evidence actually shows once you look closer at it. For years, when archaeologists found weapons in graves, they just assumed the person buried there was male, because the default assumption was that combat roles belonged to men. So even when a skeleton hadn't been properly analyzed, it would still get labeled that way. But that started to change when more detailed studies were done, including DNA analysis, and one of the most famous cases is the Burka grave Bage 581, which turned out to be a high-status warrior burial that was genetically female, despite being filled with weapons and previously assumed to belong to a man. And that wasn't just a one-off anomaly, because similar findings and re-evaluations of older graves have suggested that women did take on roles in warfare and weren't excluded in the way people once thought. Now, saying half of all Viking warriors were female is probably going too far based on current evidence, because the exact proportions are still debated and likely varied, depending on region and time. But what's clear is that the old idea of warfare being strictly male is not accurate. Gender didn't define roles as rigidly as people once assumed, and the archaeological record is forcing a more nuanced picture where social structure, status, and context mattered more than simple categories. So instead of this one-dimensional image of Viking men as the only warriors, it becomes a more complex society where women could also occupy positions that had been overlooked or misinterpreted for a long time. Story 21. That blue light from screens is secretly wrecking your sleep and needs special glasses, filters, and expensive products to fix it became one of those modern health claims that exploded way beyond what the actual evidence supports, mostly because it sounds scientific enough to be believable and easy to market. There is some truth behind it, which is what makes it stick. Short wavelength blue light can influence the body's circadian rhythm by affecting melatonin production, and early studies did show measurable effects when people were exposed to very high intensities of blue light under controlled conditions. But that's where things start to get exaggerated, because the levels used in those studies were often far stronger and more direct than what you get from a normal phone, laptop, or TV. And when researchers started testing real-world scenarios, the impact became much smaller and harder to isolate. At the same time, multiple studies looking at things like sleep quality and eye strain found little to no meaningful difference between people using blue light blocking glasses and those who weren't, especially when other factors like overall screen time, brightness, and behavior before bed were taken into account. And that's the key part. The bigger issue usually isn't the wavelength of light, it's the habit itself. Staring at bright screens late at night, engaging content keeping your brain active, inconsistent sleep schedules, all of that plays a much larger role in sleep disruption than the specific blue light component. But once the idea caught on, it became a perfect product category. Glasses, screen modes, coatings, apps, all marketed as solving a specific science-backed problem, even though the actual benefit in everyday use is often minimal. So it ends up being another case where a real effect exists in a narrow context, gets generalized into a broad rule, and then turned into something much bigger than the evidence really supports. Story 22. That eating egg yolks is bad because of cholesterol is one of those nutrition truths that stuck around long after the science moved on, mostly because it was simple, easy to explain, and got repeated everywhere for decades. The original idea was straightforward. Egg yolks contain cholesterol. High blood cholesterol is linked to heart disease, so eating eggs must increase your risk. And for a long time, that seemed logical enough that it became official advice in many places, with people told to limit eggs or avoid yolks entirely. But as research improved, the picture got a lot more complicated. It turns out that for most people, dietary cholesterol doesn't have a strong impact on blood cholesterol levels because the body regulates its own production. So when you eat more cholesterol, your body often makes less to compensate. At the same time, the bigger drivers of unhealthy cholesterol profiles are things like saturated fats, trans fats, overall diet quality, and metabolic health, not just cholesterol intake from foods like eggs. So when large-scale studies looked at actual outcomes, moderate egg consumption didn't show a clear link to increased heart disease risk in the general population, which shifted the understanding pretty significantly. Eggs, including the yolk, are actually nutrient-dense, containing protein, vitamins, healthy fats, and compounds important for things like brain function. So instead of being something to avoid, they're generally considered part of a healthy diet for most people. That said, calling them a superfood is probably going a bit too far in the other direction, because no single food is a magic solution, and context still matters depending on someone's overall diet and health conditions. But the core idea changed. Egg yolks went from dangerous because of cholesterol to generally fine and nutritionally valuable, which is a pretty big reversal from what people were taught before. And it's another example of how nutrition science, especially, tends to evolve as we get better at separating simple assumptions from how the body actually works. Story 23. For a long time, the explanation for a runner's high sounded clean and complete because scientists pointed to endorphins, the body's natural, feel-good chemicals. And it made intuitive sense that if those increase during exercise, they must be responsible for that euphoric, almost detached feeling people report after long runs or intense aerobic activity. And it's true that endorphins do rise during exercise, but the problem is that they don't easily cross the blood-brain barrier, which means they can't directly affect the brain in the way that explanation requires. So while they might play a role in the body, like reducing pain at a peripheral level, they don't fully explain the mental and emotional effects people experience. That's where newer research started pointing in a different direction. Instead of focusing only on endorphins, scientists began looking at the endocannabinoid system, which produces its own signaling molecules during prolonged exercise. One of the key ones is anandamide, sometimes nicknamed the bliss molecule, which can cross into the brain and has effects linked to mood elevation, relaxation, and reduced anxiety in a way that lines up much more closely with what people describe as a runner's high. So instead of endorphins being the main driver, it looks more like a combination of systems working together, with endocannabinoids playing a much more central role than originally thought. And like a lot of these examples, it's not that the original idea was completely wrong. It just focused on the most obvious piece and missed a more important mechanism that wasn't as well understood at the time, which ends up turning a simple explanation into a more layered one, where the feeling isn't coming from a single chemical reward, but from multiple systems interacting to regulate pain, stress, and mood during sustained physical effort. Story 24. To some degree, the idea that modern humans came from a single, clean, out-of-Africa event has been softened over time, not because it was completely wrong, but because it turned out to be far less simple and far more messy than the original version people learned. The classic out-of-Africa theory suggested that Homo sapiens evolved in Africa and then spread out in a relatively straightforward migration, replacing other human populations, like Neanderthals, with little to no interbreeding. And for a while, that model fit the available evidence well enough. But as genetic analysis improved, especially with ancient DNA, it became clear that the story wasn't just a one-way expansion with complete replacement. There was interaction. Modern humans interbred with groups like Neanderthals and Denisovans, and traces of that are still present in many populations today, which means it wasn't a total wipe and replace scenario, but more of a network of migrations, overlaps, and exchanges. At the same time, evidence also suggests that human evolution within Africa itself wasn't coming from a single, isolated population, but from multiple groups across the continent that were connected and mixing over long periods of time, which adds another layer of complexity. So the model didn't collapse. It evolved. Modern humans still originated in Africa. That part remains strongly supported. But the idea of a single, clean dispersal followed by total replacement has been replaced with something more dynamic, involving multiple waves, interbreeding, and regional variation. And this is where the misunderstanding comes in. Outside the field, people sometimes hear that the original model was disproven and take that to mean it was wrong entirely, or that humans didn't originate in Africa at all, which isn't what the evidence shows. What actually happened is that the model was refined, expanded, and made more accurate as new data came in. So instead of a simple origin story, it becomes a complex, branching process, still rooted in Africa, but shaped by movement, interaction, and time. And like a lot of these examples, the shift isn't from true to false. It's from simple to realistic. Story 25. That sugar directly causes diabetes is one of those explanations that stuck because it feels obvious and easy to communicate. But once you look at how metabolism actually works, the relationship is a lot more indirect and tied to bigger patterns rather than a single ingredient doing the damage on its own. The common chain people repeat is basically sugar equals diabetes. But what the evidence shows is something closer to sugar contributing to excess calorie intake, which can lead to weight gain over time. And that increased body fat, especially visceral fat, is what drives insulin resistance, which is the core issue behind type 2 diabetes. So sugar isn't irrelevant, but it's not acting in isolation either. A big part of the problem comes from how sugar is consumed, especially in liquid form, because drinks like soda or sweetened beverages pack a lot of calories without making you feel full, so you don't compensate by eating less later, which makes it very easy to overshoot your energy needs without realizing it. And that ties into the broader point that it's not just sugar specifically, but highly palatable, energy-dense foods in general that encourage overeating because they're designed or naturally appealing in a way that bypasses normal satiety signals. At the same time, things like glycemic index do play a role in how quickly blood sugar rises, but they're only one piece of a much larger system involving total calorie intake, diet composition, activity levels, and individual differences in metabolism. Then you get into processed foods, which adds another layer. Processing itself isn't automatically bad, but when it leads to products that are cheap, easy to consume, low in satiety, and high in rapidly digestible carbohydrates, like maltodextrin-heavy foods, it shifts eating patterns in a way that favors excess intake, whereas more protein-rich or fiber-rich options, even if processed, tend to be more filling and self-limiting. So the picture ends up being less about a single villain and more about how different foods interact with appetite, behavior, and long-term energy balance, which makes the original sugar causes diabetes idea too simplistic, because it skips over the mechanisms that actually drive the condition and replaces them with a shortcut. That sounds right, but doesn't capture the full process. Story 26. That lactic acid buildup is what makes you sore after a workout is one of those explanations that stuck around because it was simple and sounded scientific even, though it doesn't actually match what's going on in the body. For a long time, people were taught that intense exercise produces lactic acid, which accumulates in muscles, causes that burning sensation, and then sticks around to make you sore the next day. But the timeline alone doesn't work. That burning feeling during exercise fades pretty quickly once you stop, and whatever is being produced gets cleared out of the muscles within about an hour or so, while the soreness people feel later, known as delayed onset muscle soreness, doesn't even start until much later, often peaking a day or two afterward. So it can't be the same thing. On top of that, what your body is actually producing during intense exercise isn't lactic acid in the way it's often described, but lactate, which is part of a useful metabolic process that allows your muscles to keep generating energy when oxygen is limited. Instead of being a waste product, lactate can be reused as fuel by other tissues, including the heart and even other muscle fibers, which makes it more like a temporary energy shuttle than a toxin. The soreness that comes later is now thought to be linked more to microscopic damage in muscle fibers, inflammation, and the repair process that follows, especially after unfamiliar or high-intensity activity. So the old idea didn't completely come out of nowhere, because people were noticing real sensations during exercise, but it mixed together different processes into one simple explanation that didn't hold up once the physiology was studied more closely. It's another case where something that feels intuitively connected turns out to be two separate things happening on completely different timelines. Story 27. That fat makes you fat was one of those ideas that took over nutrition for decades because it sounded logical, since fat has more calories per gram than carbohydrates or protein. So the assumption was that eating fat would directly translate into storing fat. And that led to the whole low-fat movement, where foods were stripped of fat and marketed as healthier options. But what actually happened is that a lot of those low-fat products replaced fat with sugar and refined carbohydrates to keep them tasting good, which changed how people were eating in a much bigger way than anyone expected. Because fat isn't just a calorie source, it also plays a role in satiety, helping you feel full and slowing digestion, so when you remove it and replace it with easily digestible carbs, especially sugar, you often end up eating more overall without realizing it. So instead of reducing weight gain, that shift in diet often made it easier to overconsume calories, which is what really drives weight gain over time. At the same time, the idea that foods like butter and eggs are bad purely because they contain cholesterol followed a similar pattern, where dietary cholesterol was assumed to directly raise blood cholesterol levels in a simple, linear way. But the body regulates its own cholesterol production, so for most people, eating cholesterol doesn't have a large effect on the levels circulating in the blood. What matters more is how the body processes and clears lipoproteins like LDL and things like saturated fat can influence that by affecting how efficiently the liver removes LDL particles from circulation. So butter can raise LDL cholesterol in some people, but that doesn't mean it's inherently harmful in all contexts, especially when consumed in moderation as part of a balanced diet, which shifts the whole picture away from single nutrients being good or bad and toward a more nuanced understanding of how different components interact with metabolism, appetite, and overall health. And like a lot of these examples, the original advice wasn't completely baseless, but it simplified a complex system into a rule that ended up being misleading once people followed it at scale. Story 28. That the human brain stops developing at 25 is one of those numbers that got turned into a hard rule simply because it sounds clean and authoritative, when in reality, it mostly comes from a limitation in how a study was designed rather than any biological cutoff in the brain itself. The research that popularized this idea followed brain development through childhood and adolescence and found that certain areas, especially those related to planning, impulse, control, and decision-making, were still maturing into the mid-20s, which was an important and accurate observation, but the study didn't include people much older than that. So, it couldn't actually say what happens beyond that point, and that nuance got lost. Instead of development is still ongoing up to 25, it became development finishes at 25, which are two very different claims. When you look at neuroscience more broadly, the brain doesn't have a fixed endpoint at all, because it continues to change throughout life through processes like neuroplasticity, where connections are constantly being formed, strengthened, or pruned based on experience, learning, and environment. Different systems stabilize at different times, some earlier, some later, and others keep adapting indefinitely. So the idea of a single age where everything suddenly becomes fully developed just doesn't match how the brain actually works. And like a lot of these examples, the problem wasn't the original science, it was how the result was simplified and repeated, turning a specific finding into a universal rule. That ended up shaping how people think about maturity, responsibility, and even identity in ways that aren't really justified by the evidence. Story 29. That race is a fixed biological reality is one of those ideas that held on for a very long time because it felt intuitive on the surface, even though the deeper you look into the science, especially modern genetics, the less it actually holds up as a meaningful biological category. Early attempts to classify humans into distinct races were based mostly on visible traits like skin color, facial features, and geography, which made it seem like humanity could be divided into clear groups, but those classifications were always inconsistent and changed depending on who was doing the categorizing and what criteria they chose. As genetics developed, especially over the last few decades, it became clear that human variation doesn't break into clean, separate boxes, but instead exists on a continuum, with gradual changes across populations rather than sharp boundaries. Most genetic variation is found within populations rather than between them, and the differences that do exist tend to reflect adaptation to local environments like sunlight, exposure, or altitude, rather than defining distinct biological types. So while ancestry and population history are real and can be studied, the idea of race as a set of discrete, biologically grounded categories doesn't map onto how human genetics actually works. That's why organizations like UNESCO were already pushing back on the biological concept of race as early as the 1950s, and why modern research continues to reinforce that. Conclusion: what persists instead is the social concept of race, which has very real effects on people's lives, but is based on historical, cultural, and political factors rather than clear biological divisions. And like a lot of these examples, the original idea wasn't maintained because it was scientifically solid, but because it was simple, visible, and embedded in society long before the science caught up enough to challenge it. Story 30. That the central dogma of molecular biology is an absolute, one-way rule is another one of those textbook truths that turned out to be more of a guiding framework than an unbreakable law once people started looking closely at edge cases. The classic version says information flows from DNA to RNA to protein, and that's it, with no way for information to go back upstream, especially not from protein back to nucleic acids, which made sense for a long time because everything we observed fit that pattern. Then, exceptions started showing up. Reverse transcription, for example, where RNA can be used to make DNA, already forced a revision of the strict one-way idea, but even that still stayed within nucleic acids. What makes newer findings so interesting is that they start to blur that boundary even further. Recent work has suggested that under certain conditions, information from proteins might be able to influence or guide the synthesis of nucleic acids, which was previously thought to be essentially impossible in biological systems. It's still early, and these findings are being actively studied and debated, but even the possibility of protein-templated nucleic acid synthesis challenges one of the most fundamental assumptions about how biological information flows. And like a lot of these examples, it doesn't mean the central dogma is wrong, because for the vast majority of biological processes, it still accurately describes what happened. But it does mean it's not absolute. It's a model that works extremely well in most cases, with rare and surprising exceptions that remind us biology tends to be more flexible and creative than the simplified rules we build to describe it. Story 31. That seed oils are somehow uniquely toxic or a major driver of modern disease is one of those nutrition ideas that spread fast because it fits a clean narrative, but once you look at the actual body of research, it ends up being much more about context than the ingredient itself. Back in the early days of things like paleo or keto, the argument against seed oils was tied to a mix of concerns about processing, omega-6 fatty acids, and inflammation. And it made sense on the surface because highly processed foods often correlate with worse health outcomes. So the oils used in those foods got lumped into the problem. But over time, when researchers started isolating variables and actually studying these oils in controlled settings, the results didn't support the idea that they're inherently harmful in the way people claim. Most large-scale studies show that replacing saturated fats with polyunsaturated fats, which are common in seed oils, is associated with neutral or even improved cardiovascular outcomes, not increased risk. At the same time, the real issue tends to be the overall dietary pattern. Foods high in seed oils are often also high in refined carbohydrates, low in fiber, and easy to overconsume, so the negative effects people associate with the oils are often coming from the broader context, not the oil itself. The same kind of exaggeration happened with things like grass-fed beef, where there are measurable differences in nutrient profiles compared to conventional beef, but those differences are relatively small in terms of actual impact on health outcomes for most people. So it's not that these distinctions are completely meaningless, but they tend to get blown up into major factors when they're actually minor compared to things like total calorie intake, overall diet quality, and long-term habits. And that's why these ideas stick around. They take a kernel of truth, something measurable, something real, and turn it into a much bigger claim than the evidence supports, especially in spaces where people are already focused on optimizing every detail. So instead of seed oils being a hidden danger, it ends up being another example of how nutrition gets simplified into good versus bad categories, when the reality is much more about patterns, balance, and context than any single ingredient. Story 32. For a long time, mantis shrimp were held up as having almost absurdly superior color vision because scientists saw that they have 12 to 16 different types of photoreceptors compared to humans' 3. And the immediate assumption was that more receptors must mean they can see vastly more colors than we can, like some kind of living super camera. And on paper, that sounds completely logical. If 3 cones give us the full range of human color perception, then having 4 or 5 times that number should mean exponentially better color discrimination. But when researchers actually tested how well mantis shrimp could distinguish between very similar colors, the results were surprising, because they performed worse than humans at telling closely related shades apart, which completely contradicted the original assumption. So the question became, what are all those extra photoreceptors actually doing? And the newer understanding is that instead of blending signals from a small number of cones the way humans do, mantis shrimp seem to use a much more direct system, where each receptor is tuned to a specific wavelength and can trigger a response without needing complex processing in the brain. In other words, humans do more computational work, comparing and combining signals to finally discriminate between colors, while mantis shrimp shortcut that process by having more pre-labeled channels that allow for faster recognition. So rather than having richer color vision, they may have faster color detection, which makes sense for an animal that relies on rapid visual processing in a dynamic environment. And like a lot of these examples, the original conclusion wasn't unreasonable. It just assumed that more hardware automatically meant better performance, when, in reality, it turned out to be a completely different strategy altogether. Story 33. That banning or heavily restricting foreign goods will automatically strengthen domestic production is one of those economic ideas that sounds intuitive, because it feels like removing outside competition should give local industries room to grow. But in practice, it often creates a very different kind of feedback loop than people expect. When you shield local producers from competition, you're not just protecting them, you're also reducing the pressure that keeps prices low and quality improving. So instead of becoming more efficient and competitive, companies can end up raising prices because consumers have fewer alternatives. And once prices go up, demand starts to drop, which means fewer units are sold, which can then push producers to raise prices even more to maintain revenue, creating this cycle where protection ends up shrinking the very market it was supposed to strengthen. At the same time, industries that rely on those goods as inputs, like shipping, manufacturing, or construction, also face higher costs, which ripple through the economy and make everything more expensive, further reducing overall demand. A commonly cited example of this dynamic is the Jones Act, which was originally intended to protect American shipping and shipbuilding by requiring goods transported between U.S. ports to be carried on U.S. built and operated ships. But over time, it has been criticized for increasing shipping costs, reducing efficiency, and even limiting the availability of vessels, which in turn can make domestic transport more expensive than international shipping in some cases. So instead of boosting local production in a straightforward way, policies like this can end up distorting the market, reducing competition, and making industries less dynamic over time. And like a lot of these examples, the original idea isn't completely wrong in principle, because protection can help in certain targeted situations. But when applied broadly or rigidly, it often produces unintended consequences that work against the original goal. Story 34. That glass is actually a super slow-moving liquid is one of those sounds smart, so it must be true ideas that refuses to die, even though it's been thoroughly debunked. The classic argument people point to is old windows being thicker at the bottom, which gets interpreted as proof that the glass has been slowly flowing downward over time, like an extremely viscous liquid. But that explanation doesn't hold up historically. In older glass-making processes, especially before modern float glass methods, panes were made uneven to begin with, and installers would often place the thicker side at the bottom for stability, So what people are seeing isn't flow. It's just how the glass was originally made and installed. From a physics standpoint, glass is best described as an amorphous solid, meaning it doesn't have the ordered crystal structure of something like ice or metal, but it still behaves mechanically like a solid at everyday timescales. The viscosity required for glass to flow at room temperature is so incredibly high that any measurable deformation would take far longer than the age of the universe. So, for all practical purposes, it does not flow. And like you pointed out, the whole it flows. Therefore, its a liquid logic breaks down anyway, because flow isn't exclusive to liquids. Glaciers flow. Rock in the mantle flows over geological time. Even metals can creep under stress. But that doesn't mean we stop calling them solids. So the myth comes from a mix of a historical misunderstanding and an oversimplified definition of what makes something a solid or a liquid. And it's stuck because it's counterintuitive and memorable, even though the actual material science behind glass is much more precise and honestly less mysterious than the myth makes it seem.